Welcome to the All Sorts podcast, everyone. And today on the deep dive, we're diving into a really fascinating topic: homemade soap making. We got this really cool 5-ingredient recipe from Food 52, and we always like to sort of take these sources and extract the golden nuggets. For those of you who are our learner types, who love those aha moments, and who don't want to feel overwhelmed by information, we're going to try to make this as efficient as possible.
It's interesting how soap making can seem like this really complicated craft, but this recipe breaks it down into such simple steps.
Yeah.
It really demystifies the whole process.
The article even compares it to baking bread. Like, it's supposed to be meditative and rewarding.
Yeah.
Now, before we get to kneading our soapy dough, let's talk about the one ingredient that might make some people nervous. Lye.
Lye definitely requires careful handling, yeah. But the interesting thing about soap making is that the lye is actually used up in the process. So it's not actually present in the final bar of soap that you use.
That's a relief. So it's not as scary as it sounds.
Right. It's a crucial ingredient for that chemical reaction, which is called saponification, where the lye reacts with fats to create soap. And speaking of fats, this recipe calls for a blend of coconut oil, palm oil, and olive oil. Each of those brings something unique to the final soap in terms of its texture and properties.
And I did notice that the article mentioned finding sustainable palm oil sources, or, considering using alternatives.
Yeah.
So that's something important to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Being aware of the environmental impact of our choices, even in DIY projects like this, is something we should always be thinking about.
The article walks us through 6 steps, starting with mixing the lye with distilled water. Now, is there a reason why distilled water is preferred? I mean, would any water work?
It really comes down to consistency. Hard water with all of its mineral content can sometimes throw off the recipe and lead to, a final product that's kind of unpredictable. So using distilled water is just a good, safe bet. And speaking of safety, the article really stresses taking precautions like wearing gloves, goggles, and ensuring that you have good ventilation.
Yeah, safety first when dealing with lye. But one thing that I thought was interesting was this whole idea of superfatting. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so superfatting, it's basically where experienced soap makers use a slightly higher percentage of fat than what's strictly required in the recipe. And this just ensures that there is absolutely no lye remaining in the soap. And it also tends to create a gentler and more moisturizing bar.
Oh, so it's like adding an extra layer of luxury and then also ensuring that all that lye is completely used up.
Exactly. It's a technique that you can explore as you become more familiar with soap making.
So you've got your lye solution, it's cooling, you've got your oils, they're all melted and mixed. What happens next?
That's when the real magic begins. You carefully combine the cooled lye solution with the oils, and then comes the blending.
Now, they mentioned this term trace. What exactly is trace?
Trace, that's like the magic moment. When the mixture thickens up and it becomes opaque, it's a visual cue that the saponification process has begun. And you're ready to pour the soap into your mold, so you'll know you've reached trace when the mixture drips off of your blender and leaves a little trail or pattern on the surface.
So it's kind of like alchemy, watching this transformation happen before your eyes.
Really is. And speaking of transformation, there's a whole world of creative possibilities once you've mastered those basics. The article talks about how you can add fragrances and other ingredients to customize your soap.
Right. And the comment section was just, buzzing with all these different scent ideas. Lavender and clary sage, rosemary and cedarwood, even dried flowers and herbs. It's like creating a personalized aromatherapy experience.
Yeah, and don't forget about the molds. You can use anything. From classic rectangle bars to those really intricate shapes, you can really let your artistic side shine through.
Now, I know the article mentions a specific fragrance blend, but it also encourages readers to experiment, and find what delights their senses. So let's talk a little bit more about that. What advice would you give to someone who is just starting out with scent combinations?
That's a great question. When it comes to fragrances, I always recommend starting with just 1 or 2 essential oils that you already know you enjoy. You can always get a little bit more complex as you gain experience.
So kind of keep it simple at first. Now, what about people who are sensitive to fragrances?
Unscented soap is always a great option, and sometimes the pure, clean scent of natural soap is all you need.
That makes sense. Now, I was really intrigued by some of the questions that were popping up in the comments. One reader asked about substituting ingredients, especially palm oil.
Right. And one commenter suggested using things like lard or tallow as a potential alternative. But it's important to remember that any substitutions you make will require you to recalculate the recipe, just to make sure that you have the correct proportions for saponification.
So you can't just swap things out willy-nilly. You really have to consider the chemistry involved. What other questions kind of stood out to you?
There were a few comments about the cooling rates of the lye and oil mixtures. It's really crucial to get them to a specific temperature range before you combine them, and that seems to be a challenge for some people.
And why is temperature so important?
Well, it really affects the saponification process. If the temperatures are too far apart, it can lead to separation or an uneven texture in the soap.
Oh, so it's not just about, following those steps. You have to understand a little bit of the science behind it.
Exactly. And that's what makes soap making so fascinating. It's this beautiful blend of art and science.
I love that. It's like a chemistry experiment in your kitchen, but with the bonus of creating something beautiful and practical.
And speaking of the practical side of things, let's talk about some of the tools and equipment.
Okay, so we've got our safety gear, gloves, goggles, good ventilation. What else is essential for someone who wants to be a budding soap maker?
You'll need a good digital scale for accurate measurements, a heat-resistant container for mixing your lye solution, a pot for melting and mixing the oils, and then an immersion blender to blend everything together.
Those all sound like pretty common kitchen items. Is there anything specific to look for?
Well, it is really important to dedicate your soap-making tools solely to that purpose. So never use any utensils or containers that have come into contact with lye for cooking.
That's a great safety tip. Where can someone find all these tools?
You can find most of them at your local kitchen supply store or online. But here's a pro tip. Check thrift stores. You can often find some really budget-friendly options there.
Great idea. Now, once you've blended your soap mixture and achieved that magical trace, what happens next?
Then it's time to pour the mixture into your mold. And you can get really creative with this. You can use anything from a simple loaf pan to really intricate silicone designs.
The article mentioned lining the mold with parchment paper. Why is that?
It just makes it much easier to unmold the soap once it's set.
Well, that makes sense. So you pour the soap, smooth it out.
And then comes the hardest part, waiting. You have to let the soap sit undisturbed for at least 24 hours to allow that saponification process to complete.
It's kind of like a slow-cooked meal, building flavor and complexity over time. So what's happening during that 24-hour waiting period?
Well, the soap is going through what's called the gel phase. It's going to heat up naturally as the saponification continues, and that helps to create a harder, more durable bar of soap.
Oh, so even though it's called cold process soap making, there's still some heat involved.
Exactly, and after that initial 24 hours, the soap's ready to be unmolded and cut.
That must be a really satisfying moment. Any tips for cutting, for getting those perfect bars?
A sharp knife or a special soap cutter will do the trick. You can find all sorts of options online. Or get creative. Some people use a guitar string or a wire.
Wow, that's resourceful.
Yeah.
So you've unmolded your soap, cut it into bars, and then what's that final step?
That final step is curing. This is where the soap hardens up and the excess moisture evaporates.
How long does that take?
Typically 4 to 6 weeks. But it can vary depending on the recipe and the environment.
So it's kind of like aging a fine cheese, allowing those flavors to deepen and mature.
That's a great analogy.
This has been such a fascinating dive into the world of soap making. It's amazing how much there is to learn, even about something that we use every single day. But before we wrap up, I'm curious, what aspect of soap making surprised you the most?
I think what surprised me the most is really just the science behind it. It's not just a craft, it's a true chemical process. And understanding that process makes the whole experience even more rewarding.
Absolutely. And it's incredible how accessible it is. You don't need fancy equipment or years of training to make your own soap.
That's what I love about these kind of DIY projects. They empower you to create something beautiful and practical with your own two hands.
Well said. We'll be right back after a quick break to continue exploring the world of soap making, right here on the All Sorts Podcast.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive on the All Sorts Podcast. We're continuing our exploration of homemade soap making, and I'm excited to talk more about those creative possibilities we were hinting at earlier.
Me too. We talked about, fragrances and molds, but the article also mentioned that you can add other things to your soap mixture. What can you tell us about that?
Oh, yeah, the world of additives. This is where you can really personalize your soap and give it some unique properties. You can think about adding things like oatmeal for gentle exfoliation, or dried herbs for a touch of aromatherapy, or even clays for their cleansing properties.
So it's not just about scent. You can really add texture and visual interest.
Exactly. The article mentions using dried lavender buds and essential oils for a luxurious spa-like experience.
Oh, I can imagine how lovely that would be. I also saw in the comments some people use things like poppy seeds for a gentle scrub. Or coffee grounds for an invigorating morning bar.
Yeah, exactly. The possibilities are really endless. It's all about your imagination. But as with any DIY project, it's always a good idea to start small and experiment. So maybe just try adding a small amount of one additive to your first batch and see how it turns out.
That's a good point. It's easy to get carried away.
It is. And then as you gain confidence, you can start experimenting with more complex combinations and techniques. But let's talk a little bit about troubleshooting. The comments section mentions some of the challenges that soup makers often encounter.
Yeah, I noticed that too. One of the most common questions was about getting the lye solution and the oils to the right temperature before mixing. Why is that so important?
Temperature plays a really key role in the saponification process. If those temperatures are too far apart, it can cause the mixture to separate, or result in soap that's too soft or crumbly.
So it's not just about following the recipe, you really need to pay attention to the details.
Absolutely. And if you are struggling with temperature control, there are lots of helpful tips online. And in those soap-making communities that we talked about, you can even find specific instructions for your region, since the ambient temperature and humidity can actually play a role as well.
That's really good to know. I also saw some comments about choosing the right soap mold. Any advice there?
Oh, there are so many options out there, from simple loaf molds to intricate silicone designs. The type of mold you choose is going to affect the shape and size of your soap bars, obviously, but it's important to consider the material as well.
What do you mean?
Well, silicone molds are very flexible and easy to unmold, but they can be more expensive. Wooden molds give the soap a rustic look, but they require a little more care and maintenance, so it really comes down to personal preference and the look that you're going for.
What about people who want to add color to their soaps?
That's a great way to make your soap even more unique. You can use natural colorants like clays, herbs, and spices. Or you can purchase soap-making dyes. But you do want to be careful with certain colorants, because some of them can react with the lye and change color in unexpected ways.
Ah, so it's another area where experimentation is key.
It is. And speaking of resources, the article recommends a fantastic book for those who want to really delve deeper into the world of soap making.
Yes, The Soapmaker's Companion by Susan Miller Cabbage. It sounds like a really comprehensive guide for beginners and more experienced soap makers alike.
It is. It covers everything from the science behind soap making to troubleshooting common problems. And of course, there's a wealth of information available online as well. In forums, on social media, there are all sorts of soap making communities out there that are incredibly supportive and helpful. So don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions, share your experiences, and learn from others.
That's encouraging to hear. Now, once you've made your soap, let's talk about how to actually use it and care for it.
A well-made bar of soap should last you for several weeks, but there are a few things that you can do to extend its life. For example, make sure you let the soap dry completely between uses. A soap dish with good drainage is going to help to prevent it from getting soggy.
Good tip. What about storing soap?
It's best to store your soap in a cool, dry place. Avoid exposing it to direct sunlight or heat, because that can cause it to melt or the colors to fade.
So treat your soap with care, just like any other handcrafted item.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment with different scents and additives to create a soap that is truly your own.
This deep dive has been so enlightening, and I think it's safe to say that we've both learned a lot about the art and science of soap making. But as we start to wrap up, I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you kind of a more personal question. What does the act of creating something with your own hands mean to you?
That's a good question. For me, it's about connecting with a long tradition of craftsmanship and finding satisfaction in that process of transforming raw materials into something that is both beautiful and useful. It's about slowing down, being present in the moment, and appreciating those simple things in life.
I love that. And it strikes me that soap making embodies that perfectly. You're taking something as basic as oils and lye and transforming them into this luxurious, fragrant bar of soap that can really bring joy to your everyday routine.
It's a reminder that beauty and creativity can be found in the most unexpected places.
Well said. And with that, we'll be right back after a short break to continue our soap-making exploration here on the All Sorts Podcast. Welcome back to the All Sorts Podcast and our deep dive into homemade soap making. As we've been talking, I keep thinking about how the simple act of making soap, really connects us to history.
It's true. Soap making has been around for centuries. It's amazing to think about people throughout time engaging in this very same process.
Right? From ancient civilizations using ashes and animal fats to create those like basic cleansers, to modern soap makers experimenting with, exotic oils and botanicals. It's a craft that has really stood the test of time.
And it's not just about the history, it's about the science too. We've talked about saponification, but there's this whole world of chemistry involved in soap making.
Right, understanding the properties of different oils, the role of lye, how temperature affects the process. It just adds this whole layer of depth and fascination.
And it really makes you appreciate that final product even more. Knowing that you've created something beautiful and functional through this intricate chemical dance, it's really rewarding.
Absolutely. And I think that sense of accomplishment is what draws so many people to DIY projects like soap making. It's about taking control, being creative, and connecting with a tangible process.
It's about slowing down in a world that's constantly rushing us forward and finding joy in that simple act of making something with our own hands.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage our listeners to explore the world of soap making for themselves. Don't be intimidated by the process. Start with a simple recipe, gather your tools, and just dive in.
And remember, the soap making community is incredibly welcoming and supportive. There are tons of resources available online, in books, through local workshops, so don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions, share your experiences, and learn from others.
It's amazing how something as simple as soap can bring people together and spark creativity.
It really is. And who knows, maybe one day you'll be sharing your own unique soap creations with the world, inspiring others to embark on their own fragrant journeys.
And with that inspiring thought, we've reached the end of our deep dives into the wonderful world of homemade soap making. So if you're looking to add a little bit of luxury and creativity to your life, why not give soap making a try? And as always, thank you for joining us on the All Sorts podcast. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more deep dives into fascinating topics. You can also find us on X, Instagram, and Threads, where we share even more insights, inspiration, and behind-the-scenes glimpses into the world of all sorts. Until next time, may your days be filled with creativity, discovery, and of course the delightful scent of homemade soap.